Oops, sorry, good afternoon. It's Tuesday, September 4th. Welcome to your Sioux Falls City Council informational meeting. We will call this meeting to order here. First up is the UDC meeting. Councilor Neitzer, would you like me to come back? I can.
Actually, I just found it,
Okay.
so we're good. At the UDC meeting that we had a few weeks back, we just talked about a couple of things. I was appointed to the TCC, which is a Transportation Coordination Committee. It's a subcommittee that's responsible for coordinated public transit, and that I'm replacing Councilor Rolfing, and that was a very good first meeting that I was at, very fascinating. We approved the final TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan for 2019 to 2022, which is a CIP for road projects and the MPO. And we also looked at some standards. State DOTs must adopt and enforce standards for pavement, bridge, and system performance, and we just had to adopt a resolution endorsing those standards that were set by the DOT, and that's it.
I think that's a record for the shortest UDC briefing. Thank you, Councilor. Our next item is the administration communications. And this is new. I'll draw to your attention if Ms. Beck would like to maybe just address what we are doing with this. I know we all received an email, but for the good of the citizens, I think it would be important to give that communication as well. So welcome.
Sure. Erica Beck with the Mayor's Office. Thank you for allowing or giving us the opportunity to provide some regular standing communication to the council. The purpose of this is not to go into great detail on anything, but just try to provide you with some emerging topics, so to speak, of what's coming in the next 30 to 60, 90 days from the administration, so that we're giving you as much time as possible to be prepared for those things. When I do talk about different initiatives, agenda items, so forth, that will be coming forward, I'll try to make sure to provide you with a point of contact when I do that, so that you know who to contact at the administration level if you have questions about that. And hopefully that will benefit you moving forward as well. I'm not going to promise that I'm going to hit everything in the next 30, 60, 90 days, because I'm sure there are going to be things that I will miss, but ideally with a standing time here, we'll be able to move this forward and try to make it more productive as we go along. So a couple of things just real quick that Councilor Sale asked me to address, which I'd be more than happy to do so, is the current status of our finance director role. So as you all know, you've met our new city attorney, Stacy Koistra. He's joined us, but we still have that finance director role empty. We do have 2 interviews on Thursday morning, so we're making some progress on that front and hope to have someone on board as soon as possible. Although I would be remiss to not point out that we've had a fantastic interim director who we've been able to work with over the past several months going through the budgeting process, and of course he's here today, so hopefully he heard me say that. And then also with respect to the email that the council received last week on the reorganization with respect to central services and the new Department of Innovation and Technology, I'll just go through that in a little bit more detail. You've heard Mayor Tenhaken speak, I think, quite frequently with respect to his concept for innovation at a local government level and how we really want to integrate that within each of our departments moving forward. And that was really the premise behind this reorganization. GIS, IT, and communications, which was multi-services, will all remain in that Department of Innovation and Technology. There were 2 other departments that were in central services. One was facilities, and that will now be managed under HR by Reed Holson. And then Fleet, which will now be managed under Public Works by Dean Borkart. So just to give you a little bit more background, that's the remaining focus for those divisions within central services. Okay, so a couple of things just to make note of with respect to agenda items here coming in the next couple of weeks. Next week, September 11th, informational meeting. You guys have had some correspondence, I think, with Jill Franken, our health services director. The ambulance contract and their earned extension will be presented to you at informational next week. So any questions that you have for either Jill or Gary Myers, the REMSA chair, or Mike Postma from Paramedics Plus, those can be asked and answered at that time by those individuals. Moving forward, there will be a first reading at ordinance regarding that extension, and that will come to you in early October, probably October 2nd, and then for a second reading in mid-October. And of course, Jill is your contact for that topic, but she'll be presenting a lot more information to you next week at informational meeting. Public Services Committee, there's several items on that agenda for next week, including sanitary landfill and just a general cleanup of Chapter 57. Council meeting, forestry ordinance changes, those were just presented to you at last week's informational meeting by Kelby. September 18th, that will be your first update from Matt Nelson on the Village on the River development project with respect to our parking ramp. So he'll give you a status update at that time, and then you'll be getting regular updates quarterly on that project as well. Perhaps even more than quarterly, depending upon the questions that you may have. So we haven't got that quite figured out yet, but just to give you an update that's coming next week. Council meeting on September 18th, you're going to be seeing a resolution requesting approval of the Main Street bid assessment for 2018, and that is an annual bid assessment review that comes forward to this group. That has already gone through the notice of hearing process, is my understanding, and that funding is utilized by Downtown Sioux Falls. It runs through its own committee to approve the plan for that funding. But if you have any questions on that prior to the 18th, make sure to contact Dustin Powers. A couple of things. You've heard Tom Huber and Mark Cotter, I think in the past several months, talk specifically about a supplemental appropriation for the dreaded snow removal that we'll most likely see yet this fall. That will be coming forward in mid-October. October 2nd, I have the opportunity to come back to informational meeting and present to you on our city's historical use of tax increment financing. So I'm looking forward to doing that. That's at an informational meeting. And then the following week, October 9th, at informational, we've invited Bob Munt, who is the new president of Sioux Falls Development Foundation, to introduce himself to the council and talk a little bit about his vision for the Development Foundation moving forward. So I've mentioned to Bob several times that I think it'd be great for him to come in front of you all on a regular basis and talk about what's going on at the Development Foundation and where their strategy is for our community when it comes to economic development. Also at that informational meeting, there will be an update on the 8th Street Bridge rehabilitation, which is an exciting project for downtown because it incorporates one of our historic bridges. October 15th, at informational, just as an update, you've all heard a lot about our water reclamation master plan. Mark Cotter will be here with his team to go into a lot greater detail with respect to that project, including several pieces of that project that include the main pump station replacement. It includes pump station 240 and capacity improvements, and a plan specifically for that in that presentation, as well as a general utility rate presentation as well. So all of that will be during your October 15th informational meeting. And then one item of note that you'll be hearing a lot more about from our team moving forward, but in November, our public works team, specifically engineering, expects to come forward to talk about the fact that they've exceeded budgetary amounts for platting fees this year already. So currently we've collected over $400,000 in platting fees than what we anticipated to collect, and we anticipate probably upwards of another $200,000 to $250,000 because of all the growth that's been occurring within our community. So they will most likely be coming back to you in November at some point to talk about an additional appropriation that would give them authority to use those funds in 2019. That's all I had for today, but next week we'll have more updates as well and anything new moving forward. So if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Otherwise, we can move on to the regular agenda.
Councilor Staley.
This is so nice. Thank you for doing this. Yeah. So I got a question. Where are we at with the Huey building?
I have actually not had any conversations with the proposed owners of the Huey building, so I can't tell you where they're at in terms of a conversation on what next steps are.
So you, like in the next month, you don't foresee that coming back again?
I wish I could tell you that.
Spring up anytime.
Right, I wish I could tell you that. I honestly don't know. I haven't had any conversations with Green Acres, and I haven't had any recent conversations with our planning office to know where they're at in that process either. We can get you an update though. That won't be a problem.
Well, I was just wondering how that time frame, because I knew that there was possibility it was going to be brought back again.
Yeah.
Councillor Solberg.
Yeah, I just want to quick reiterate thank you to you and the administration for this proactive approach to keeping us up to date and in the loop. Very much appreciated. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Councillor Starr.
Yes, thank you. I guess my question, one of the things when you were talking about platting fees, as part of that presentation, I've had a number of people approach me that it's expensive to develop land in Sioux Falls because the platting fees are expensive, and you know the history of it, and I think most of us around this dais understand the history, but to explain it to the citizens. So as part of that presentation, if we could take a couple of minutes to say, this is how we chose to pay for arterial streets and that part of it, I think it would be really good for the public to understand and revisit that a little bit, that this was a choice that was made by previous councils to, this is the way we chose to fund it rather than raise other taxes and to fit that in. And I think that would be a good part of that presentation as a reminder to the community.
Yeah, a little bit of a historical perspective on that.
Absolutely.
Yep, no problem.
Anything else? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. City Council open discussion. Any open discussion? Councillor Neitzer.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that this last Friday I spent half a day with Public Works team, particularly the water reclamation folks, and did a little tour around the city. Mostly we did different things that had to do with what they do to manage the whole system, the collection system as they would call it. So the first thing we did is we went out and was able to see how the cameras work to camera the pipes. And we went through one of the new pipes on Arrowhead Parkway, and they call that warranty work, where they use their little robotic camera to go through there, and then they can check to make sure everything is installed properly. So if a pipe is separated or the gasket wasn't right or whatever else, that they can make the contractor fix it right then and there before we end up owning it, and then we have to fix it. And so they're able to find those things right away, and they're doing that on TLS Road over by where I'm at. So that was a neat thing to see, and those cameras are pretty incredible in what they can do with it. And then we spent time observing a jet truck crew cleaning a storm sewer. And it's pretty amazing if you look down in those storm sewers how much stuff gets down there. And to keep the water flowing, then we went and spent time with the jet truck cleaning sanitary sewers. And you can imagine what that was like, but that's a very important thing to do. And they just go around town all year long. And as they've talked about, they just have a couple of crews, and they're doing this entire city, and they keep adding and adding and adding, and they haven't made an ask for a new employee because they're trying to do with what they can, and they know how big of a deal it is to ask for a new employee. So, and I'm sure there's all kinds of places around the city where the city has exploded, but we haven't added more staff. And they're trying to keep up, and they know they need to keep up, because it's with them doing this on this cycle, they've dropped the number of sewer backups considerably in the city by doing that preventative maintenance. And then just by luck, there was a water main break, so I was able to go out to that and watch all the teams work together to excavate the site, get down 6 feet, find the pipe, figure out why it was broken and how they cleaned it up, and then they patched it, and then they buried it again and all that stuff. But so it was just a neat thing to see, and this kind of was inspired when I was at the water rec plant and they were talking about the whole collection system, just to get a scope of the 900 miles of pipe or whatever it is that they're maintaining. There's a lot that goes on in this city every day, and it's pretty amazing to see. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Councillor Kiley.
Thank you. And pardon me for being a little bit late to the meeting and not being available to give the report. I was engaged in a conversation with a certain reporter that I will not name, but he works for the Argus Leader, and he's in this room right now. But anyway, that's why I was late. I had an interesting message left to me by Director Cotter here this past Friday afternoon, that while he was at a local auto dealership for some maintenance matters of his own, that an employee complimented the city for their quick action on a light that was requested during a national night outing. The request was presented to me. I passed it on to Director Cotter. He passed it on to his department, and Director Cotter was sending kudos back to me. However, the kudos all belong within the light department for their quick response in that particular case. So that was nice to hear. The main thing that I'd like to report on is the state veterans cemetery. I know that it's been pretty quiet there, but we are really, really close. And so I hope that soon we will have reached an agreement on the gifting agreement. To me at first it was a little amazing that to gift a piece of property, especially 60 plus acres, would be difficult, but I do understand that all sides involved have to carefully look at the agreement and make sure that all sides are protected, and we are very, very close. So that project is moving along, just as a FYI for everybody else on the council as well as within the public too.
Thank you. Any other open discussion? Seeing none, we'll move to our first presentation, subdivision ordinance update. Welcome, Sam.
Thank you. Sam Trebelcock, City of Sioux Falls Planning Office. I've brought the subdivision ordinance to council a couple of times. This time it's because we're spending a little bit additional time staff-wise reviewing a few items. And because it's been since March, wanted to give you all a chance to provide a little bit of a review and then also some of the changes that have been taking place. Just again, very quickly, what is a subdivision ordinance? What's it about? It's obviously regulating the subdivision of land, but at the same time, it's not just breaking up those pieces of land into blocks and lots. It's coordinating streets and roads and utilities and other subdivisions together. That's one of the main things you're looking at when you're doing a preliminary subdivision plan. And then you're also at the same time coordinating with the zoning ordinance and with those engineering design standards to make sure that the lots and blocks can be incorporated as part of the engineering design standards in the zoning ordinance. Now, to show you where we've been through, we started this process with a meeting here in April of 2017, so it's been over a year. You can see all the different meetings that we've had, whether or not it's been an open house or infrastructure review advisory board meetings. We also had a city council informational, again, back in March, that we thought at the time we were going to move forward, but again, we saw that there was some need to take some additional staff review and public review. So the process at this point, where you can tell we're at the third city council informational meeting here at September 4th, and would intend to bring it back to you for first reading mid-September, September 18th, and then the city council adoption on October 2nd. Planning Commission public hearing would be tomorrow night. Thought this might be kind of an interesting way to show you a little bit about the different components of the subdivision process, review process. Most of what you deal with as City Council and Planning Commission too is at that preliminary plan stage. That's including review of all the components, usually the bigger preliminary plan, the review that you're looking at. It doesn't have everything that needs to be reviewed in the engineering design standards at that point, but certainly all that's required for public review is done at that point. Those are adopted by you at City Council. But after that, just so you know and are reminded, the development engineering plan takes place after that. And that's really when you're bringing in those development engineering plans and you're looking at those in a little more detail. It then goes to plat and construction plans, and you can see the amount of detail that's required as you go through those plans become a little bit more greater. But a lot of times the preliminary plan is what takes, in some cases, the longest. So review of some of the major changes. These are the same changes that we talked about last time. So they included some private street standards. There was never any private street standards up until this point. There still isn't at this point, but that's what we're proposing to include, some standards for private streets. Also to enhance some complete street standards for neighborhood connectivity, and also for the potential for new bike trails to add dedicated trail easements. Those are things that we'd like to beef up as we're looking at additional trails. We don't at this point have any flag lot pole standards. We want to make sure we look at those things. And then just some other things like online review, subdivision reviews, creating some consistency with state planning law, moving some of the lot and block standards to preliminary plan from what now is in the development engineering stand process. So we're moving those standards a little bit further forward into the process. And then simple things like the mayor and planning commission chairman would no longer need to sign plats. It's not really required by state law anymore, the way we do things. And that would help kind of keep things moving a little more quickly, we think, too, as we've heard from the development community. The changes since March, really pretty minor things, but for the most part, one of the biggest things would be like the transfer of ownership plats, big piece. When you bring it into the city, the developer just has annexed it, not quite ready to develop it. They can do a transfer of ownership plat. They don't have to pay platting fees on it yet, but they also know that they have to come back in and plat. We had that listed under the minor plat, which created some problems in some cases. A minor plat, usually they're smaller, tiny plats that already utilities is available for, and a lot of times those can be available for platting at that particular time. So we just wanted to create some the ability to more understanding of how to move through that process. City engineering's plat certificates, there's now 3 instead of 1 with this changes. There's one for inside city limits, one outside the city limits when you're doing platting, jurisdictional plats, and then one for a road authority outside city limits. That's very specific. It could be the township, it could be county engineer, it could be the city engineer. And then just some very simple things on consistency and clarification of several sections, like, again, just what the name and the title is. It's obviously not the 2008 anymore, it's the 2018. And consistency changes and the other things noted there. Other than that, I would take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Sam. Any questions? Councilor Neitzer.
Just one question. So as far as who signs the plats, who will remain signing plats?
Well, you still have the city engineer and the planning director are signing the plats. We already do administrative approval of all plats. That's listed as a part of the process in the ordinance. And so they would still be signing the plats. So really what happens, just so you get familiar with, the preliminary plan is what council, the mayor, they're approving, what you're approving. So we just have to make sure that we can keep consistent with that process through the plat. And so then planning commission planning director and engineering, city engineer sign those plats. And then there's some others that also at the county level have to sign it to get it actually recorded. In this case also, we made one change. It used to be city clerk would sign the plat, but now it's finance office. We've signed the plat, and that's consistent with state law. So that.
Okay, what I'm just getting at is any time that, you remove signatures or approvals to quote unquote streamline the process, there's always a risk that you lose a set of eyes, and there might be, I don't know how plats would be abused, but just to make sure it's there.
Right, and what we have to ensure is that, anytime that we're doing this, that you're doing just that. So that's why we have planning director and city engineer, they're signing the plats, and staff is reviewing that, but it has to be consistent with the preliminary plan. So what you approved, what mayor's approved.
I see. That's what needs to be verified. And do you know why the mayor was ever in the loop on something like that?
Well, and I think this is a holdback to where before we were doing administrative approval of plats, Actually, it was coming through City Council and Planning Commission. So that's why Planning Commission chairman was signing off on it, because it was actually coming through for an approval at Planning Commission and at City Council. So you would have it on your agenda. The plat would have been an agenda approval item.
Yeah, and maybe one other question. So at the Planning Commission, as long as I remember, one of the first items was they just say plats. Is that going to go away, that consent agenda item, or do they still approve plats at the Planning Commission?
Right, that would go away. See, what was happening is that a lot of cases, the plats were actually being approved and signed even before it get to consent agenda. It didn't make a lot of sense. If anything, it was for notification as much as anything.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Brecky.
Questions on that? So has state law changed on that? Who's supposed to be signing the plats? I thought, just who's supposed to be signing them according to state law now?
Well, I don't know when it would have been, if it would have been early 2000s or late 90s, there was a change in state law to allow administrative approval of plats. So that gives you the option, not all cities do it, but it certainly gives you the option to do it that way.
So the council's no longer approving plats?
Correct. And that's been for the better part of a decade.
Okay, and when are they signed? After what approval process does the city go through in order to authorize the final signature of them?
So it would go through a staff review process. Goes through to city engineering, and then it goes through various staff people. I would say it probably takes a couple weeks. A week. It would take about a week process, unless there was found to be some things that need to be changed, and they could go back and forth. Yeah.
So then they're no longer then certified, and so they're no longer public records? Is that, because they used to be, again, signed by the clerk, signed by the mayor, following approval by the city council. So all of that's been removed to just an administrative function?
Correct.
Okay, and that's consistent with state law?
Yes, that is
Okay.
consistent and available.
So now it's just the finance officer and
the
the planning commission?
It's still city clerk right now. We're suggesting it needs to be changed because state law requires that it be done by I don't know if it's the finance office or whatever is allowed under city law. That would be the finance office. Is it only the finance officer that state law allows, or is it a choice between the city clerk and the finance officer? It doesn't actually allow for the city clerk, and I'll have to check that, and I could find that for you. It's very specific, and that's why we're changing it in state law. So basically the state has shifted that obligation over to the finance director as opposed to the city clerk? Yeah, and like I said, I could find that because there's a statute that says that this is what's required and defined, and city law says that it's deemed the finance office to be what's required under city law for that. And then where are they filed after they're filed with the Register of Deeds. So down at the county? Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Councilor Staley.
First, Sam, can I ask you to take the mics and just part them just a titch? Because we're getting some feedback coming through. Or static. So back to the question that Brecky was asking about, what happens if we just leave it the way it is with the Planning Commission and the mayor signing off? You're saying that's not legal, or we could do that?
But like I said, that's a holdover from years past. It doesn't.
But it doesn't. What's it hurting?
It isn't. It isn't hurting anything. It's just slowing it down. In particular cases, we're having the Planning Commission chairman coming in for something that they don't even see, and we're asking the mayor to something to sign that they don't even specifically. Because all it needs to be is consistent with the preliminary plan.
Well, and I agree with Councilor Neisert's words that sometimes having different sets of eyes on something is a good thing. In October, you're going to have a first reading? Is that?
First reading right now is September 18th.
Okay, because I don't see that on our little update thing here. September 18th. And the second reading is in October then?
Would be that October 2nd. That's what we're proposing right now, yes.
Okay. Then, private street standards, I know back when you were bringing this up, we were talking about maybe not having a sidewalk here and on one side or no sidewalk. So what did you come up with? What are those private street standards going to look like?
So the major point on private street standards would be consistently to have them at least 28 feet in width and paved. Also on non-residential, they would be consistent with an urban street where there would be sidewalk required and street lights.
On both sides?
Sidewalks on both sides, yes.
Okay. And street lights? And curb and gutter?
I have to look at that on non-residential, but it wouldn't necessarily be required on residential.
It wouldn't necessarily be?
Right, correct.
Oh, okay. And so the home builders and everybody was pretty comfortable with that?
Yeah, yes. I mean, this is the first time we've kind of moved forward with any kind of standards. So right now, there's no standards at all.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which creates some difficulty with a lot of the utilities and also with the engineering department on road standards as you want to move forward.
But has it, with this private street thing, has there been any concern, or have since they've seen what you're unveiling here, have they seen it? Or
Yes, oh yes. Yeah, because we've been through with, as I talked about, the Infrastructure Review Advisory Board.
Well, I know you were having meetings with people and so I wasn't sure at the end of the day when it's all firmed up that they've seen it.
Yes.
Said we're okay with it.
Yeah, and it's not changed, that section has not changed since,
and then
since the March meeting.
the last thing I was going to ask is, and this just came up actually with a resident dealing with drainage. Mm-hmm. And apparently there's an ordinance in new development that you have to have some type of a drainage plan if you're building something to ensure that you're not going to be flooding somebody else's basement. Is that correct?
Do you know? Yep. Yeah, so I'm going to let Jeff take that.
Okay.
Thank you, Jeff Schmidt, representing planning staff. Take a quick step back. Just to clarify, private streets are because they're private and they're privately maintained, privately constructed, and we have no responsibility or obligation to them. So that's different than a public street where they have to meet our public standards and then we maintain them, we operate them, they're a public roadway. So in a lot of developments, they would rather have their roads, their driveways, they're privately maintained and operated. So that's what Sam was talking about.
But then they're going to have certain standards, though.
The 28 feet, correct. But
so you're private. You're private, but you're not able to just do whatever you want.
Correct.
And curb and gutters, not going to happen.
Yep.
Sidewalks on both sides will happen.
Only in commercial or office areas, not in residential areas.
Okay.
Yep.
And street lights will happen.
Not in residential areas, only in office.
Okay, so, all right.
Because they're private standards. And today, if we don't pass this today, there's no standards. They build these townhome areas, apartment areas with private roads, and there's no standards. They just build them. So if you go down a street and it says a private road, there's no standards. They just go out there and build them to whatever they want. And we're saying we have to have some standards to how you build a private road.
Okay, so thank you for that. Now let's
All
move
right.
on
So
to
drainage, yes.
the drainage in a new development.
Yes, drainage in a new development. There's engineering design standards, and in our preliminary plans, as Sam pointed to, when they bring in a subdivision for residential or non-residential, they would have to have the preliminary plans, and it says, including preliminary plans for water, sewer, streets, and drainage. We'd look at preliminary plans for how they do drainage, and then as it moves forward, then they do a development engineering plan for drainage and bring it to a final, better quality, and highlight it. And then when they bring construction plans in, they'd highlight it again. So every time engineering drainage would look at that specifically at preliminary stage, at development stage, and at construction stage to make sure that they're meeting drainage issues.
So that from one resident is not ever going to be negatively draining into their neighbor's basement, right? I mean, everything's going to be going.
That's the correct, yes.
So, and then, so it just became I became aware this week that apparently in established neighborhoods, if you have a vacant lot and somebody chooses to build next to you, then there is no standard, there's no ordinance that will give them protection about how that drainage will happen.
That's probably a better question for the drainage engineer and public works, because in general, we look at subdivisions and the subdivision requirements, and for a single lot, they wouldn't be a subdivision. So I would assume that, but I don't know for sure.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? I do have one, if don't go far. Can you talk a little bit about the private roads? I understand what you're doing, but I have a little, I mean, it's private, you know, it's your private property, and I understand needing some sort of standard. Who can just say, hey, this road's a private road? Who gets the opportunity to deem a road a private road?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Okay, so again, on this, they bring in a preliminary plan and they say, in this housing subdivision, there's going to be all these single-family homes, which we live in. And they say, we want to put in private roads. And right now, again, they say, and we want to build them all the 15-foot roadways. I mean, like, that's just awful, but there's no standards. We're saying at least build them to 28 feet. Typically, we would say, based upon standards in traffic and volumes, we would like it to be a public roadway, 60 feet of right-of-way, 32-foot street width, curb and gutter sidewalks. However, if you build it to a private road standard, please understand it's private. We're not going to maintain it. If there's potholes, forever, this development has private roads. And then when the phone calls come to you and us later, we go, you live in a private subdivision that we have no control and jurisdiction over. Those roads are your responsibility and obligation. And that developer chose to sell you homes on a private road. We discuss it, we bring it up with them, but typically more often than not, it's in twin homes and townhome neighborhoods, not so much in single family neighborhoods.
Right.
But we look at them through this review, and engineering, fire, police, risk management, we all review them at the same time and bring those issues forward. Right. There's not a black and white argument there. When can you have them? When can you not have them?
Okay, and that makes sense, because I've been on one with twin homes, and they're literally on top of each other, and it is just like rows and rows and rows, and it's a really narrow road, and it's so close to the street too, and I mean, it's a little unsafe as cars are going through. You really have to pay attention, because you're really putting a large, high density in these tiny little roads through there, which the traffic did go slower. When the roads are wider, they tend to go a little bit faster, so I get that.
And we want to get to that next. We wanted to have that discussion with, I mean, we've been doing this for a year and a half, having this discussion, but we couldn't get to when do you allow privates and when don't you. First, we had to say, what's the private standard?
What's the minimum standard? Gotcha.
And now that we have, well, if we get to having a private road standard, now we want to talk about when are you going to allow them and when aren't you going to allow the private roads.
Now, if somebody does want lights, can they request lights and have them put in?
Yes, because they can always go above and beyond.
They can go above and beyond. Yes. So, I mean, it's just a safety thing with having additional lighting.
And we talk about ADA and the ability to have sidewalks. If you ever get challenged to having ADA requirements, you're going to have to put in sidewalks, but you don't have to at the beginning. If you don't put in sidewalks, that's your risk, that's your obligation.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. And then I want to make one other comment about the whole process of the platting and who's signing off on what. I appreciate you streamlining the process, because as we know, time is money, and we appreciate the fact that I don't know why somebody would need to look at something to sign off on it if there's no legal obligation with it. And so, again, I appreciate you streamlining this, moving it forward in a way that makes sense, but making sure that there's still checks and balances on it. So thank you for that.
I had 9 plats that I had to sign today. I review all the plats individually. I have to look at them all. I have to review them all through the week, and then they show up today. I had 9 plats, and it took me an hour just to sit there today and sign on the line, date, stamp. I have to sign them all after I've already reviewed them. So that's the time commitment that you have every week when these plats come through. And then for like a planning commissioner or a mayor that's just going, so I just have to sit here and sign these?
Right.
Yeah, it's a big time commitment.
I understand that. Thank you. Councilor Neitzert, I know I saw your hand up again.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw in, I would assume one of the reasons why you would want a minimum standard is even though a road is private, that doesn't mean that we abdicate our duty from taking a fire truck in there.
Correct.
If a house is on fire. So
Right.
we need to have some minimum standard so that we can serve that particular development, so.
Which is why Sam came up with the 28-foot minimum. If they're building less than that, we couldn't get the fire trucks through.
Yeah, so I think public safety is probably the biggest part. And I'll give you a little cheat sheet in city ordinance that says a private street is a place. So Empire Place around the mall, that's private. Most of the trailer parks, there's something place. So those are private roads. So those are all maintained by
When
them.
those citizens call you and say, I live on
Something place.
they're
Yeah.
living on a private.
Parakeet Place, there's a lot of them in my area. And so, for example, they, in one of the large manufactured housing developments, they put in streetlights, but that was their deal, that they did it to improve safety at the request of their citizens. But they're their streetlights, so.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other, Councilor Staley?
So it's always place. It'll say place. It's never just a through street.
99% of the time.
Okay, and do private roads, do they usually end up in a cul-de-sac kind of thing? Or do
No.
they, sometimes they're a through
Correct.
street?
Yeah.
And when someone's doing a private road, do you require that they have more than one, I mean, that there is a way to get out? Or
Access point.
more than one way in and out, or?
We look at that with these preliminary plans to make sure, even with the private roads, yes is the answer. Because you have to look at how many units are going to be accessing that roadway, and that was part of that discussion we had 2 years ago to make sure that you had the correct access, whether it's public or private, yes.
Do you have any standards for apartment entrances?
Yes, but we have driveways and we have roads, and the fire and emergency services looks at them, but it's really going to get down the weeds is what I'm trying to say in stammering, because a lot of those are sprinkled, and they have sprinkler units in them. So on some of them, they don't have to have roads to them, they can have driveways to them. So there's different standards for
But in an apartment, you don't have to be able to drive through.
No, you don't, correct. You can have
A dead
hammerheads
end.
and dead ends, and because again, they have fire hookups and emergency service access where you don't have to loop it. Yeah, fire has different standards for apartments than they do single-family homes that aren't sprinkled.
Thank you.
Yep.
Jeff.
All right, thank you. Appreciate your time. Our next item up is Parks and Rec Master Plan Professional Services Agreement. Welcome, Director Don Kearney.
Good evening, council members. Don Kearney with Parks and Rec. This is just a follow-up item to a previous contract that was presented to the City Council for our Parks and Recreation Comprehensive Plan. As a follow-up, I think there were some questions about the funding sources for this plan because we are using operating and capital. And so we tried to provide a highlight of the different tasks that are associated with that comprehensive plan and where we were assigning operating and capital dollars towards that. And so in the main 5 tasks, the project management, progress reporting, and data review, really feel like those are general categories that would apply to both capital and operating. So those are split out half towards capital and half towards operating. Same would be true with community profile and public engagement process, where half of those dollars are assigned across capital and operating. The parks, trails, facilities, and program analysis really is more heavily weighted towards the capital for obvious reasons. Financial funding and marketing, again, those are generally split across the two different sources of funding. And then we also are, again, providing more focus on the capital side for the implementation and master plan development, which is largely the capital planning process. So you can see there's a roll-up about $50,000 for operating and $153,000 for capital for a total of $202,000, which is the value of the contract with Pros Consultant, who does these master plans across the country. And I know Tom Huber is here as well to assist us with answering any other questions. And so it was just a follow-up from a previous council meeting.
Thank you, John. Any questions from the council? Councilor Starr.
Yes, actually, I think if Director, I can start with Assistant Director Huber and kind of work through that part of it, because I guess where my concern came when I pulled this from the consent agenda is there were really two things going on, is the study itself and the need for it and where we came from and doing that in part of the certification of the park systems. And then my other part is mixing of the precedent that we're setting of doing operating and capital money and putting those together and where that capital came from. So if you don't mind, I've got just maybe a general way of getting here so I understand the process, and maybe my fellow councilors can jump in and I'll yield it here in a minute or two. But so the one thing that jumped out to me when I was looking at this, let's say the fire department decides to buy a fire truck. We budget $1 million for the fire truck. It's over a couple of years that it takes by the time we order the truck and it comes in and we're happy with it and we close out that project. So out of that $1 million, the truck comes in at 900,000 of that. Where does that 100,000 go then? Does it go back to the capital fund, or could the fire chief say, we need a Suburban to move the battalion chief around because we've had one fall out of use?
First of all, the money would stay in the case of the capital portion. It's within the sales and use tax fund, which is a separate fund from the general fund, which is the operating part. So that's first. And the second part is that in the capital side, you would have to have another project to slide the money to it that was short on funding once that other part is completed. And then that is brought over as a notice of transfer to the city council, so you receive notice that such transfer was to occur.
But it's possible that you can keep that capital line item open for 3 years until you need that next project, rather than putting it into a capital surplus like we did paying off the Lewis and Clark bond funds earlier. So then in some cases it just goes back, and sometimes the department would hold on to it.
We try to keep a pretty true capital program where when a project is completed and closed out, that money is if there isn't another project that is short or is in need of that additional funding, that it does roll back into the fund overall and is reprogrammed in the next year. As you know, every year once we complete the annual audit, we generally have an amount left over in the capital program that is available for new appropriation. So, but we try to keep a very true capital program. It's not just move from here to there and everywhere. It's only, and it stays within its same departmental allocation, so we're not getting those out of line. And a lot of times it's within these street projects where you have, street projects where, we allocate so much money and we have a list of the streets that we're going to go through, and we're just going to keep rolling down keep going to the next one on the list as the money is available.
Makes sense. I guess my concern is in a situation like that, if I was a department director, my incentive would be to maybe bump up my capital program as much as I could so that I can continue to work down that list outside of the council's priorities when it comes to budget. It seems to me that if you have a capital item, and I seem to be picking on the fire department, I don't mean to, but I like talking about fire trucks, so it's like all guys do. In that scenario that I painted, it would be even better to put $1.1 million or to say where that is and to be able to do whatever projects that work and it because there's a limited number of capital projects. So I guess that's where my one concern kind of in this overall thing when it came is that we true up and make sure that, to me, when that fire truck would be delivered, that 100,000 in my example would go back to a capital fund rather than staying within the department, and then it would be reallocated and rebudgeted is my concern and think would be a better place. The other thing that stood out to me is this mixing of capital and operating money. From what I can look at with the study that we're doing, and when you go through the contract and the proposal that we received, it looks operating. It feels operating, and what concerns me is that we're trying to take money that's already there and put it together to fund this. And it just seems like when we break this out, it breaks out 75-25 between capital and operating, and it's mixed. I look at task number 4, where it's financial, funding, and marketing analysis. Reviewing of our website for the Parks Department, reviewing our social media, and coming up with ways of improving our communication with the public feels operating. So the thing I did is trying to understand the difference between capital and operating expenses. When I go to the city's policy, the capital asset policy, just a quick read, capital assets are real or personal property that have a value of $7,500 or more, are tangible in nature, and have an estimated life of greater than 1 year. And then capital asset expenditures are classified as capital outlay or expenditures in the 47 category. And that's from our capital asset policy, which I'm sure you're very much more familiar with than I am. I'm having a hard time mixing these two things, and we're setting a really bad precedent for an item that wasn't budgeted. You know, we've transferred, you notified the council when we transferred the capital money to the Midco Aquatic Center and development and trying to put it to gather it all together. So again, I'm struggling with this being a capital expenditure. So the other thing that stood out to me in this, when we started transferring the money to put this project together to pay for it, the consultant contract is for $202,000. But we put $256,000 into the revised funding plan. So is that to cover us if it goes over? And then when we mix those funds or commingle them, how do we decide where it goes back to? Does it go back to capital? Does it go back to operating if that money isn't expended and used?
Okay, to start with that part first.
Sorry, I threw out a lot.
Yeah, I was trying to remember them all. To start with that part first is when Parks was first putting this together, I believe they really looked at this because they have an aquatics facility study that was to take place that's programmed in the capital program. They have an ice study that they stopped because we decided to go this comprehensive route to make more efficient use of the money. So it was capital related, but in addition, there was operating budget set aside for a rate analysis and some needs assessment on that side of it, and so there was budget in both places, and it's appropriate to pay for it out of both places when it works for both. And in this case, as Don mentioned, as they've explained, it's much more capital related, much more facilities and infrastructure related to the park system. The last time we did it was much more operating related. It was much smaller. They rolled in some capital studies into it, some past capital studies into it, and Don or Tori can speak to that. But it was much smaller in scope, and really, the part that was done was more operating related. In this case, from the analysis that was done, is it's much heavier capital related, and we have to follow those capitalization policies. Our auditors are going to look at that. This one reaches to the level that why we thought it was appropriate to split it in the first place was that it reaches to that, it's not inconsequential now. There's enough operating stuff in here that we think part of it should be paid for by the operating budget. But as to the having the excess in the capital side, quite frankly, when you're doing a study of this scope, that's not a concern. It's better to err on the side of caution and have the extras set aside just in case, as they get into it, they find things that need to go further, and the amendment or the agreement needs to be amended. So that's from the capital and the operating perspective of it. As far as, one of the first things you talked about was the capital plan. First of all, you have to have a capital project in the plan in order to transfer money to it. We just can't make one up and transfer it. And so the projects are already prioritized and are already priority. And I think we all realize that the resources are much too precious to let somebody try to inflate their costs. I think the departments, along with us and others that are at the table, and we're not going to let them, pile excess money into a project just to hold on to it.
And I understand that too, that you don't want to come back and ask for more either if you underestimate what a project is going to cost.
Correct.
And that's, a big part of that too, and that there are chances where there are some optional parts of this study too, when you look at the master planning part of it, whether it's a website to share information with the citizens, whether that's a choice that we would add later. Again, that's, separate from an overall policy standpoint that, it just surprised me that you can budget for one thing and then hold on to the excess when it comes in under budget as long as it stays within your department. And there might be a priority in police that make more sense to spend that on than to stay with my fire truck example, or that they may, that we take a look at the overall capital money that's there. And that's probably deeper than I want to go with this for today. So that's more of a policy decision separate from this item. So,
but unless they have a project that is in need of the additional funding, we wouldn't allow them to just transfer it to another project just to hold on to it. There has to be a project that's in the queue that needs to be done, that's looking at coming in. The budget is a plan, and you're trying to work a plan and work it as expeditiously and efficiently as possible, yet making sure that you're totally transparent and that everybody has the information to make decisions, but you don't have to hold up those decisions forever. And so it's a part of just efficiently working through that plan and making sure that we're putting those dollars to great use. And we wouldn't just allow somebody to just put money into something to hold on and hold on and hold on and never put that money to use. That's when the money needs to expire at some point. If your project comes in under and you don't have another project that's out of balance in the other direction, because until you get bids, you don't know. They're coming in up and down and all over. And one thing we don't want people to do is if everybody padded their projects, then we'd have the problem of we couldn't work through the list, efficiently. So it's a part of trying to hold them true. We don't want to be over budgeting or under budgeting. Try to hit that sweet spot.
I'll yield back to if anybody else has any questions.
Okay, we'll come back to you in just a moment. Councilor Sale.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to say as a newer member of this dais that I appreciate the way that this process gone. Councilor Starr pulling it for a deeper explanation, and Director Kearney for pulling together all of these things to make it so it's more cohesive and more comprehensive, and Finance to go ahead and give us that deeper explanation on how we can commingle these funds and make sure it's all appropriate. So I just wanted to make that observation. I think you guys did a great presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions before I go back? Councilor Neitzer.
So I definitely see the logic how you got there, but I just thinking about it, I'm maybe a little squeamish, and maybe you can help me a little bit. And I see how you got here in this particular case, but I'm just trying to think of and I don't have a long institutional knowledge. I can think back, at least not being on the council, when I would see like an aquatics master plan in the capital program, and I would guess because that could be justifiably capital because it was a master plan to develop capital, which was swimming pools, so it was probably clean.
Yes.
Or it's one and not the other. But when you're taking the operating and the capital, it just, Has this been done before in previous master plans or anything like that?
I don't know on the master plan side, but I know that if we do a master plan project and we do not, and we get to the end of the year, and as we're going through our annual audit, and it doesn't turn into anything, we will have to expense that. We can't capitalize something that doesn't materialize into a project or into a capital asset. So, you know, we will work through the process to make sure that the accounting is correct. We do work through a lot of these. We see it, not much of this side of it, but more on the between funds. So when you're doing a street project and you have a water main that needs replaced and a sewer line that they're all old and expired and need to be totally redone. So we will use money from the water fund, use money from the water reclamation fund, and use money from the sales tax fund for the street portion. And you try to allocate that out as best as you possibly can. The engineers give us pretty good detailed information to allocate those out. So it's not unprecedented. It's certainly not common in this case for operating capital. But again, we aren't going to be able to capitalize something that's operating, and we don't want to throw operating stuff into the capital side. The allocation was done as it is for a reason, and that is as we walk through it with parks. Here's where the main focus is, but here are the other pieces. And like I said, there was budget in both places for it as well. So it from an accounting standpoint, it's the right thing to do.
Sure. I guess I could get it, and I totally understand when it comes to when we're doing major road projects, because we might be replacing water mains, so that would go to the water division, right, and you split it out that way, and that makes sense. And I'm not accusing it in this case. I'm just thinking, trying to think down the road. It seems to me that, let's say I was squandering money in the operating fund, I could start playing fast and loose and calling something capital, so I could take capital money out and make it work and start moving money back and forth. And maybe I'm being inspired by the fact that I've been reading article after article about Phillips to the Falls with looking at the audit stuff. So, but
You run a much better ship than that in the internal audit division. It's either the internal auditors or the external auditors. They pull through this stuff as they should, and we're not. It's straight up. We're not trying to. Yeah, you can hear the cases of those, but I think our external audit and the work that the internal audit team puts in to evaluate that, and your budget staff, and it's done correctly here.
Well, wouldn't it? Maybe last question. I get how one could sort of do this allocation, but wouldn't it just be cleaner to just say we're just going to pay all of it out at operating and just be done with it?
No, because these are. Then we'd come back the next time and we're going to do one specific to, well, let's say you followed through on the aquatic master plan or the facility master plan. Well, that one is specific to designing, the next aquatic facility or replacement of our existing aquatic facility, specifically to facilities and to infrastructure. And that needs to be in the capital side of it. It needs to be capitalized to those projects. And so, yeah, it would seem to be cleaner, but it's not inconsequential when you have significant amounts of money where it becomes material. If we're talking, 10,000, 20,000, that's one thing. But once you start running up into these bigger numbers, it really becomes material to our financial statements, and it needs to be materially correct.
Okay, thanks.
Councilor Staley.
Say, Tom, just to back up, you were giving just an example of something, and I think I heard you say, you said we could draw to a project from 3 sources, and I didn't catch the first one, but the last 2 I did catch, that we could commingle this into a project. What you said just like 5 minutes ago is that we could draw from a water reclamation fund, which would be the enterprise fund, and we could join that together with sales tax money. I heard you say it, and we could play it back, correct?
Yes, when we're completing a street project, that is totally replacing a water line.
Right.
It's not just a break, because if this.
Project.
It's a total project,
get
and
it.
you can go to the capital book and you'll see the funding sources right in there. You'll see it straight up. There's water funds, there's water reclamation funds, there's then the sales tax fund, which is the street portion. You'll see projects that have all three parts of them, and that's where, that's why we have accountants that keep track of this stuff to make sure, and the engineers telling us what part is what. And we want to make sure it's accurate. Again, the users that are paying their water fees want to know that their money's being invested in the water infrastructure. If you're paying your water rec fees, you want to know it's being paid for water rec. When you're paying your general taxes and you pay your sales tax, you want to know that's going to the general streets and it's not being siphoned off to these other areas. And it's straight up accounting.
Right, but I heard you saying sometimes those are going into the same place.
Well, they'll go into the same project. The funds are kept separately. We don't but you have a project and you're going to pay for that project with the correct source of funding.
Councilor Starr, I know you had a couple other questions.
Yeah, I do. I'll be quick. And I guess your answer to Councilor Neitzer cleared up a few things for me, but what I'm still seeing is that if we wanted to build a pool, I understand how you could, at the beginning, start with capital money to do a study of a need and what the rates would be when we build that pool. And that then design money would also be a capital improvement or a capital expense going to build that specific pool. Where I'm having a hard time is that we're taking a study of the overall parks and putting a master plan together and saying that a lot of that is a capital expense. And I have thick skull and I went to a small college, so it takes a little bit, but trying to understand getting me there is a little more difficult. And maybe that's deeper than I
think it could help if we backed up to the study that was completed the last time. The study was about $70,000 and it was operating. And that rolled in those capital pieces. The operating portion of this, no way would you need to spend $202,000 for just the rate analysis and the needs assessment and those pieces of it. That was a $70,000 lift because it rolled all those capital ones in. And I think when you think about that, that kind of brings this one back to it, that since this one is really being rolled out and those, especially the aquatics and ice piece have to be done as part of it, and that's totally capital related, it really does reside in that capital area, and it just all kind of makes, hopefully that helps drive home why the last one was out of operating, but there were capital pieces that came along with it, and why this one, when you do a more comprehensive approach and you're going to do these capital pieces of it, it needs to be capitalized part of the capital.
I'll get it. It'll be 4 o'clock in the morning and all of a sudden I'll
happy to keep answering any questions or email us.
I guess my next area is the other part, or the B part of what I was doing is the study itself. And maybe just having Director Kearney come back and do just a quick overview of, I learned a new acronym as part of this, so I need a little bit about CAPRA requirements and where we're going for the next 10 years and where we're headed with the overall master plan, why it's necessary, and the consultants and that part of it. So
yeah, thanks for the question. First of all, the city ordinance requires that we do a comprehensive Parks and Recreation system plan at least every 5 years. The last time we had completed one was in 2015. The other thing that this does, as you mentioned, CAPRA, which is the accreditation agency for Parks and Recreation agencies, is that by having these plans completed, you meet certain standards within accreditation that are required of every agency and institution as a fundamental standard. And so this planning work gives us credit towards the certain standards that it applies to around planning and rate analysis and those types of things. And so, yeah, it's a very comprehensive plan. It going to look at programming. It's going to address, what is our fee structure and revenue strategies. It'll address marketing, but we really want to focus as well on what are the future of our aquatic facilities, what are the future of our trails, future parkland development, What are the demographics of the city? You know, one of the things we try to do is where are we growing? What is the makeup of our community? And then the other aspect of it is that we want to know what the community believes we should be investing in Parks and Recreation, and so that'll be an aspect of it. And there's just a lot with a growing city that you want to plan for. And so this will basically update our plan and really create that roadmap for the future of our Parks and Rec system over the next 5 to 10 years, so that it can inform our operating budget, it can inform our programming, it can inform our capital program, so that it's not just Don sitting in his office dreaming up all these ideas of what he thinks we should do. It's a community focused planning process where we'll bring all those stakeholders together and help us inform what we want the future of our park system to look like.
Perfect, thank you. The other thing that I'd point out reading the report a little closer was talking about something I've been harping on a lot lately, is talking about looking for both public and private grant opportunities and foundation dollars and things, and I was impressed to see that that's part of this overall study, that we'll take a look at the finances and say where are those opportunities to continue to look for outside of our tax dollars from the citizens of Sioux Falls. So thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Any other questions from the council? I just have a couple little things. As I was looking through this, and I thank you for your time I've sent you several emails and we've gone back and forth, and I sat in on the community engagement meetings that we had back in 2014 with it was about $70,000 is what it was, and I did the community and operational, it was engagement for community, citizen, oh my computer shut off, citizen engagement and operational programming was the focus. And I sat in on the whiteboard sessions, and they did many different community whiteboard sessions, which was really helpful, and it was a good study with good information that came back. And of that, I look at task 2 on here, community profile and public engagement process, and that's really what we focused on, and that amount came from the $70K from the other group. And so when I look at this and compare, I was fine with this until I saw it really broken down of 26 for this and 26 for this. And so I'm struggling with what is capital of community profile and public engagement process, because we did a whole study all about that that came strictly from the operating budget. And so I'm struggling wrapping my mind around that. I'm also struggling a little bit as we talk about carrying the dollars forward, and I think that's a bigger policy discussion that we as a council should have as far as carrying those dollars over, and we've talked amongst ourselves a little bit with that. And so nothing I need a statement on or anything like that, but I think that's something that we as a council should have that conversation. Councilor Starr gave an example of additional funds being left over to be able to fund other programs and projects that come in. And when that does, I think it's important that while it's just a notification from the council on the transfer of the funds, I think it should be more than that. And there should be more than just a small notification of knowing where that's going and what the plan is. And so I think there's certainly more work to be done on this. I appreciate your time bringing this forward. We will have public input at the end. I think there is some interest in that. So we'll move to the next item if there's nothing else, which is the city attorney department budget. And then we'll open it up to public comment at that time.
Tom Huber again with the Finance Office. We have Stacy Koistra and Karen Leonard here to back me up, but the attorney's budget is pretty straightforward, and I thought, Stacy's new and Karen's been so busy with our things, it'd just be easy for us to quickly walk through the attorney's budget from a financial perspective, and they can follow up and answer questions. So if you quickly take a look at what their operating budget looks like. Overall, the budget is up just over 3%, totally attributable to normal inflationary increases, primarily within the wage and benefits, which the attorneys is very people related. It accounts for 81% of the attorney's budget, the personnel costs do. The next largest category is professional services, 13% of their budget, which also includes support for the Multicultural Center. And this is the one area where their budget changed, and for good reason, and I'll walk through that. And it kind of goes a little bit back to what we were talking about earlier, is the reason you see the money move from professional services to the utilities. It's still staying to fund the Multicultural Center as the city pays the utilities, but the city pays those utilities directly, and we need to account for those correctly, which is a utility expense on our ledger. So the Multicultural Center is receiving the same amount of funding. They did the $187,000 in total when you look at utilities, drive to arrive, and program support, as they did the previous year. It's just allocated out differently because we do pay those utilities directly. It doesn't go to the Multicultural Center and then to utilities. If you look at professional services broke down, I know there were some questions in this area, and we'll break it down a little bit further in a second. You can see that as this is the second largest category of their budget, the Multicultural Center again is basically a zero-sum game. The $50,000 went down to utilities line, again still in the sub-program of the Multicultural Center. You can see legal services for outside counsel, and I'll show a little bit more on that on the next slide. Online legal research, which is access to legal databases. This would be primarily Westlaw that they would use. You can see HRC, the Human Relations Commission program support for community education and training. HR investigations for contract investigators and mediation type services. And the rest, I think, are all fairly self-explanatory. We'd be happy to answer any questions on those. It's just they're part of their normal operations. And again, none of these categories are, you see some minor increases. One of the questions we were asked is to pull a little bit this outside legal services apart a little bit further. And this is across all funds is what we're looking at. And I hope we've got the entire list here, but I can't make any promises. Some of them get, we do have a category on the operating side, but some of these are capital related. And so we tried to make sure we got those all busted out as well here. But we are like any other business, and that is outside legal services is a standard part of the business. To provide that legal expertise in very specific use where there's specific legal practice. It mitigates risk when we're dealing with complex legal and regulatory environments. It augments the city's legal team when we are short-staffed as we were this past year. So those are the three main reasons that I would say is why you see outside legal services. A review of the specifics, it's reflected basically of just that. The bond counsel fees, that's a very specific practice of law related to our bond issuances. In 2018, we had the refunding issue, and then we had the public parking issuance. In 2017, we had the Lewis and Clark bond refunding, and in 2016, we had the city center bonds. So those are when you engage bond counsel to walk through those very specific legal areas. The pension trust and legal services, again, to update the trust accounts and ordinances. Very important that we stay in tune with the Internal Revenue Code, make sure our plan is updated accordingly, and this reflects all the plan changes that were made when the city pushed all new employees to the state retirement system and closed our plan. The public parking ramp, it was a case where one of the first large public-private partnerships, a development project like this, and the golf course management agreement, we asterisked a few of them that are more related to the attorney's budget specifically, and would be somewhat due to the attorney's office, augmenting attorney's office staff, as we were without a city attorney until Stacy now arrived. Would be the golf course management agreement, assisting with the Falls Park post-action report, wireless communications, and the railroad relocation or railroad redevelopment contracts. See some on utility side of things, and then there's some miscellaneous ones, which is everything from subpoenas, a little bit of work on the TIFs, code enforcement appeals, other agreements, tax, very $2,000, $3,000 sums here and there. So I hope that answers a little bit of the questions as to where, what their budget looks like and where do those dollars go to. And again, these are across all funds. The 4 with asterisks are the ones that would have been paid for out of the attorney's actual budget.
Thank you, Tom. Any questions, Councilor Staley?
Tom, how many attorneys do we have on staff?
7? What? 9?
And then, do we have some paralegals? How many?
Karen Leonard, Deputy City Attorney. Currently, we have 3 paralegals on staff.
And then how about other support staff?
Administrative assistant. I think we just have the one, Luann Foster. Oh, and Jamie Palmer's in our office as well. She's our liquor licensing specialist, and we have Mike Hall, our risk manager, is under our office as well.
Oh, okay, all right. And then I had a question just for Tom. Thank you, Karen. With that golf course contract, I do believe we paid them more than that. Maybe it's back to the 27, let's see, golf course. Yeah, it seemed like I think we paid the attorney like closer to $40,000. Because the first payment we didn't have to put it was under a certain amount. And then you came back and it was in the consent agenda to give him more. I believe it was closer to 40.
Just to clarify on that, partially correct that we didn't bring his original contract was under $25,000, so that did not come before you. But then when it triggered over the $25,000 threshold, then it came back to you. But as far as I know, his bill was at 27. It wasn't up to 40. We can double check that and pull his invoices if you'd like. Yeah, I didn't double check that.
Yeah, because we at the time, I think it was over 20. I thought it was, he wanted another 10 or something. Tom, do you know more about that?
We had an amendment to his contract, and
we might have budgeted for it, but this is what we actually spent. Right. So this is reflecting actual spending, not necessarily the budget. So we might have added more to that agreement than we actually spent.
Well, and I thought maybe it was 2 different. I thought there were 2 different years together on that. I think he was paid
17 and 18.
Yeah. And maybe that.
Yes, I think there was. I think the first payment was in the.
Payments were incurred and billed. So.
Yeah, I do believe he was paid before that, and then it was after the first of the year, and then there was.
Yeah, I.
And we ran into the overtime situation with that, so I think that also that he was paid extra.
Yeah, and David Bixler just reminded me, we had an amount not to exceed in his contract, so I think that's accurate. What Tom is saying to you is that he had an overall amount not to exceed, but his actual invoices came in at 27 total, and there was 2 parts to it, like you said.
Thank you.
Any other questions in regards to, go ahead, Councilor Starr.
Yes, Tom, just one quick one. Do all legal professional services run through the attorney's budget, or would there be professional services, say, in outside? Oh, that's what this did. It broke down. It pulled it from.
The pension trust would pay for their part of the specific fees for those. In the bond council case, the bond issue. So the parking fund would be paying for was part of the parking bonds. The sales tax fund would pay for their part of the bond issuance. So. Public Works, the enterprise funds would pay for their part of the utilities. So the ones with asterisks are the ones that really come out of the attorney's budget. We probably should asterisk miscellaneous because some of those might as well, because you're dealing with subpoenas and stuff. And that's kind of a miss on our part, so we probably should put an asterisk on that one.
Where we pay into the pool for insurance, does that, like, costs associated with the South Dakota Assurance Alliance, that's in which budget? Or then it breaks down by each
liability fund, the internal service fund for the liability.
And then each department is billed out.
Each department is assessed the cost based on their claims incurred and risks that are outstanding.
That's as nerdy as I can get for right now. I think it's dinner time. Good stuff. So, thank you.
Any other questions? Seeing none, we will open it up to public comment.
Scott Harrisman, Sioux Falls. I think Pat brought up a good subject, and I remember
Scott,
when...
if you can move the microphones back out. Because
back?
Yeah, out like this.
Out
Yep,
like
out.
that. New system, and it doesn't work.
Yeah, otherwise, we get terrible feedback. I know everybody comes to the podium and they love to grab them, so.
So anyway, when David Fifley was still the city attorney, one night he was asked at a council meeting or an informational, I can't remember, the question that Pat kind of asked is, what are the, does the legal budget, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm asking, does the legal budget, everything go through the attorney's office, or do they have their own accounts? According to David Fifley, of course, he's not here anymore, the city attorney's office had their own budget for outside counsel, and then he said every department has money budgeted for outside counsel. So if that's true, if that's still the case, this is not the whole report, for one, and for two, I'd really like the public to see that. How much money we are actually spending as a city on outside counsel. In other words, Parks Department, Fire Department, Police Department, you know what I'm saying. Take every department and show us the actual amount we're spending on outside counsel. Because I can guarantee you $216,000 last year is probably not an accurate number. I know for a fact that whether that was 2016 or 2017, we spent $100,000 on outside counsel fighting the event center siding to keep it secret. We spent $100,000 to keep that secret. So I would really like to see that broken down to see how much money the city is actually spending on outside counsel for the entire city and every department. And then earlier we were talking about doing another study about our parks. It's something that I've thought for a long time, and I've been talking about this for years and years, is that we should actually do a study of our parks to see how well they're used. I think there's a lot of parks that aren't being used at all. And this whole half-mile formula is kind of silly. We should actually build parks if they're going to be used, not based on how close they are to a house. For instance, about a month ago, I drove past Frank Olson Park, and it's on both sides of the street. There was people at the pool, but this was around 1 o'clock on a Saturday, beautiful day to be out in the park. You know how many people I saw in those parks? 0. The next Saturday I drove by the same time, and I saw about 5 kids out there playing in these huge parks. What somebody said to me is, when we're building these new developments and housing developments and stuff, a lot of these apartment complexes and stuff are putting in their own parks. So here's my idea. Why not do a study to see how well these parks are used, and in more of the central area of Sioux Falls, not on the outsides. And then if they're not being used very much, sell the land to a developer to build apartments or housing, but discount the land to them on the thing where you'd say, you have to leave so much green space, since this used to be a park, you have to leave so much green space to be used by the residents of your apartment. We'd be solving affordable housing issues. We'd be solving a funding thing where we wouldn't have to fund as many parks as we fund now. And we would be solving a density issue. When I see someone saying, we got to hire a consultant to do a master plan of the parks, all I see is a department that wants to expand itself and wants to have a bigger budget and wants to be bigger. It doesn't show me that they're trying to be fiscally responsible. And I think this is a better plan. We've for years given the developers TIFs and all kinds of other subsidies to build in our city. When are they going to give something back to us? And this would be a perfect way for them to go, we're going to give you this land at a discounted rate to build affordable housing, but you got to leave some green space, and then you have to take care of the green space. I think it's a good idea, instead of spending another 100 grand, 200 grand, or whatever we spend on consultants, to basically tell us what we want to hear. You know, like the Spellerberg pool. We pretty much hired a consultant to tell us that we needed a pool at Spellerberg. So that's my idea. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else like to speak on any of the items? Seeing none, we will adjourn this meeting.